All right, so this lecture is going to be about victimization. And we've been working our way up to this. As you might imagine, I really want to say something about triggers. A trigger is really, it's nothing more than a sort of classically conditioned anxious response to material, but this particular material today could make some of you all upset. And I encourage you to just take some deep breaths and get up and take a breath if you need to. And uh, yeah, I encourage you to take care of yourself that way. So usually when I start this lecture, I start with this case example, and I'm going to put this in the notes for this video. But the example is just something I found on YouTube. It's nothing professionally made. It's made by somebody who says that she has suffered from sexual abuse at the hands of her grandfather. But I think it's a good clinical. Um, it rings clinically true to me. And I think it's a good idea to watch it and ask yourself about clinical impressions and what you think of the girl who's, and I call her a girl because I'm not sure how old she is, um, but she's still a teenager. So go ahead and watch it. I'm going to pause for a minute and then talk about it. Okay, so some things I want to ask you about this video, first of all, is just um, how old do you think this girl is? And the reason I ask that is because I think a lot of people think she's younger than she actually is, the way she says mommy. And there are some people who talk about this kind of trauma as almost developmentally arresting, at least parts of you. Um, she's also got a little, like a baby blanket that she's got wrapped around her. So she's got some things that make her seem younger than I believe she is from the notes that were on the original video. Here's another question I have for you. I think this is really important. Is that in the States we want to call one person the victim and one person the perpetrator, but I want to ask you to think about, maybe from a Winnicott perspective, who failed this girl? Who failed her? And probably what you want to say is that her grandfather failed her, at least, right? But other people failed her too, and I think you're all probably, it's not so hard to imagine that people didn't notice what was going on. I believe she says in the video she's cutting on herself and she's wearing long sleeves. It's that Winnicott concept of attunement. We actually call this failure of attunement, when people fail to notice that there's kids in trouble. And all adults do, or all parents do this to some extent. Kids can hide that they're in trouble too, right? As she did. But there's a failure of the whole system, maybe in the teachers that didn't stop the bullying. So a lot of people, and that's one thing I want to point out, is there is a systems perspective to a lot of sexual abuse. Somebody didn't notice it. Somebody was hiding something. It's not usually about one person on one person. Okay, and you can probably see in here all sorts of Winnicott issues, problems with the holding environment, um, with normal delinquency, her doing things to try to elicit a better holding environment. And then CBT, what are some CBT concepts that would apply here, or some ways that she may be thinking that could get her into trouble, or that could be problematic for her? And probably one that comes to some of you all's mind is a really common thought, is that in some way this was my fault. The issue of fault, that can become a little political and even philosophical, but I think there's a lot of women and men who get sexually abused who think, I should have yelled louder, I should have screamed, I should have fought harder. My body responded and I liked it, and that must mean that I did something to bring it on. And by the way, sometimes sexual abuse victims do get a physical pleasure out of the act. Or maybe I like the attention from that babysitter or my dad or whoever. So a lot of times there's some internalization of blame that we can challenge. Because even if you were 5 and you went and you knew it was going to happen and you sat on your grandpa's lap, you still deserve to not be invaded like that. Doesn't matter what you did. To some degree, in our society, we hold kids completely blameless. Um, so I hope I've iterated to you just how important the whole system is with not just the occurrence of childhood sexual abuse, but also the reoccurrence of it or the maintenance of it, and some of the developmental things that happen when you're sexually abused. And some people appear younger or act younger in some ways. And also this idea, the CBT idea that it's not your fault. The other CBT thing I'll say that sometimes comes up is just the idea of boundaries. I think people who've been sexually abused many times often start to feel as though their body is not theirs. Like each and every one of our bodies is ours to decide what we want to do with, right? And I think people who've been sexually abused often feel like it's not theirs, and have a heart, and maybe more susceptible to abuse later in life, as we'll see in a minute. Many of you have seen data, but here's the data that I've had. Some of the more recent data I've had is worldwide childhood sexual abuse is about 1 in 5 for girls and about 7.9 for boys. Depends on the country and the continent. Some countries in Africa have very high rates. I'm not entirely sure if child brides are factored into this or not. The EU as a whole is down to 9.2%. And the US, depending on how you ask the question, is somewhere between 15 and 25% of women and 5 to 15% of boys. So I asked myself, why is it so high in the US? And it probably has something to do with secrets and uh, and sex education and a variety of other kinds of things that make our culture different. Oops. It can be very complicated to study childhood sexual abuse. One thing about abuse and all kinds of victimizations is that there is a tendency in society to blame the victim in more ways than we usually blame other kinds of victims. If somebody steals your car, people usually don't say, "Oh, you shouldn't have left it there," or "You shouldn't have bought such a nice car," or I mean, maybe if somebody left their keys in it, you might say, "Well, that was kind of dumb," but you still blame the person who took the car. Childhood sexual abuse can happen to anyone. There's not any set profile of an abuser or a victim or of the abuse itself. There's all kinds of different ways that abuse can happen. And by the way, it can look quite different. And there was a article that came out a while back that looked at victims of abuse, and it found that how the abuse happened was important. I think clinically, to me, this makes a lot of sense, but the article was very controversial. I think, again, this is the difference between politics and psychology is politically speaking, people wanted to say all abuse is equally as bad. But this article actually found that certain kinds of abuse had different kinds of harm. For example, sadistic abuse, abuse coupled with physical harm, where the perpetrator got sexual gratification out of harming a child, did more damage than other kinds of abuse. So it does matter, and you want to listen to what happened. You don't want to just say all abuse is equally this is the same. There's not one single set of sequelae. It can look quite different in different people. Another thing that profoundly complicates sexual abuse and treating sexual abuse is these mandatory reporting laws. The fact that we have to tell if you're the therapist. And this really complicates our job. I understand why these laws are in place, but it means that a client who wants to tell us knows that you may have to divulge what they, normally you keep everything confidential, but the mandatory reporting law may actually cause some people to not tell because they don't want you to tell. And again, I want to say here, I've said this many times, that there's a difference between sociology and politics and psychology. I really try to focus on the individual meaning of the experience as opposed to the morality of it. I've recently treated a woman, a 30-year-old-ish woman, who was she was, I would call it raped by someone when she was a teenager. She does not use that word. This is somebody who's very bright, I should say, and very well versed in topics like this. But for various reasons, she's chosen not to call it that. And even though I may have my own opinions about it, I've challenged her on it some. I've said, some people would call this rape. She says, I know that, but I can't be that black and white about it. So it's important that we hold that in mind, is that the client is going to have their own interpretation of events. So here's the thing about mandatory laws and why they make things complicated. And I want to go over the definition of mandatory reporting laws and then show you and talk about the important components of the definition. So mandatory reporting laws, here's the definition of them in the states, but each state has laws requiring certain people, and everything that's in red is in red for a reason, to report concerns of child abuse and neglect. While some states require all people to report their concerns, many states identify specific professionals as mandated reporters. These often include social workers, medical and mental health professionals, teachers, and child care providers. Some of you have helped out at summer camps and you've had to sign a statement saying that you understood that if you heard that a child was abused, you knew you had to report it. These laws in the states, they often say that you can either tell the police or some sort of authority on child abuse. And there's some disadvantages to telling the police if they're not trained in it. You don't want them to go pound down on somebody's door and traumatize the kid more. Sometimes they're trained and they're okay, but usually there's an agency like Child Protective Services in every state that you can also call, and they have trained people to handle it. So what does this mean? Let's take a look at this again. Requires certain people. So each state, and by the way, Denmark has its own mandatory reporting laws, and many countries do as well, but each state specifies the people that this pertains to, which professions it pertains to. So some states are very loose, and they say if you hear about this about your neighbor, you have to tell. And others are more stringent, and they list only a few professions. Every state has something on their books, though, and they all specify which people have to tell. Another important word here is this word concerns, to report concerns of child abuse. This is important because you do not have to know that the child was abused. You just have to have a suspicion. These laws are like this because they want to make the bar very low, and they want to make it to where if you even have just a half a whiff that somebody's been sexually abused, you have to tell. Now, let me give you may be thinking, okay, so why is that so weird? And I don't necessarily think it's weird, but let's take a sort of iffy case. Let's say you're doing some play therapy with a 5-year-old, and the 5-year-old takes a little boy girl and a boy doll and a girl doll and simulates that they're having intercourse with each other. That's kind of weird for a 5-year-old to do that. And that's, by the way, that's stuff that I've seen happen. What do you think about that? Now, let me tell you something else, is you can't ask the child, why are you doing that? Did you see somebody do that? You can't ask them, because you can taint their testimony if you ask them a leading question. Psychologists, we are not forensic investigators. And so you have to ask them questions in a very particular kind of way. Otherwise, you can taint their testimony and they'll never be able to testify about it again. So as soon as you hear about something like this, you have to decide what to do, and you don't even get to check it out. You just make a call. Mandated reporters. Okay, mandated reporters. So I think I went over all of the important facts in this, and yeah. So if somebody discloses this to you, and now you have an obligation to report. And let me tell you a couple of ways to handle this. First of all, every client who comes through your door, you should do a consent form with. You should tell them what treatment is going to entail, that it's going to be confidential, and what the boundaries of confidentiality are. So that first session, I tell every client, I keep everything confidential except